conversation we're hoping to have tonight and to continue tomorrow in the conference, we want to talk about how climate change is going to affect our lives. We want to move beyond just the science into how a changing climate, a warming world is going to affect a myriad of different things. Things like a library and museum, things like your health, things like government policy, and so forth. And to kick it off tonight, we've invited three very distinguished guests to start that conversation tonight and to have a conversation about how climate change is going to affect our everyday lives. To chair the panel is Dr. David Skorton, who is currently the president and CEO of the Association of American Medical Colleges. David has an extraordinarily distinguished career. If I were to read his entire CV, we wouldn't have time to actually have a conversation tonight. Let me just say that aside from the position he's held tonight, he previously was the president and CEO of the Smithsonian. Prior to that, he was the president of Cornell. Prior to that, he was the president of the University of Iowa. And prior to that, he was a path-breaking and pioneering cardiologist. He's going to be moderating the conversation tonight, and he'll be joined by Dr. Renée Salas, who holds a number of different appointments at Harvard University. She is a medical doctor who has recently been elected to the National Academy of Medicine, and for her work on climate change and how it is going to affect health. She was on the original planning committee of the National Academy of Medicine's Grand Challenge on Health and Climate Change, and she continues to serve on committees related to this work. Also joining us is Mathy Stanislaus, who is a recent arrival to Philadelphia. He is the Vice Provost and Executive Director of Drexel University's Environmental Collaboratory and holds degrees in Chemical Engineering and Environmental Law. He's had a number of different positions, including the Interim Director of the Global Battery Alliance, which was looking at clean energy. But he also served 8 years in the Obama administration. He was a Senate-confirmed Assistant Administrator for the EPA, where again, he was looking at environmental justice, climate, and sustainable operations. And so it's wonderful to have these three up here tonight to talk about what it's going to be like to live with climate change.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. And at the risk of embarrassing him, we have to say one more thing. Patrick is a very distinguished member of the national sort of milieu in libraries and museums, one that I've followed for a long time, and he does an amazing job here. We want to thank you, Patrick, for what you do. You got most of that early stuff about the APS correct. I was there when Franklin had the original idea. It was over a poker game. I lost, but he got the credit for it. But thank you for all you do. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. Not only those of you who are in person. Isn't it great to be in person? I mean, it's amazing, right? Amazing. And for those who are watching the live stream or listening to the live stream, we're very glad to have you with us as well. So Patrick has already introduced my distinguished colleagues, and it really is a thrill to be here. Let's see, Patrick already talked about that, so you stole my thunder, so I'll throw that one out, no problem. This discussion could hardly be more relevant in general. It could hardly be more relevant than the headlines today related to Hurricane Ian. And we had hurricanes, of course, and storms before climate change, but as warming occurs in the oceans and elsewhere, the rapidity of change and intensification is changing, and that's just a very immediate example that's in my mind tonight because of colleagues and friends who are living there, and I imagine the same for you. We also experienced, all of us, a summer that was noteworthy for all the worst reasons. The wildfires devastating large swaths of land in California. And I grew up in Southern California, and we occasionally had a fire, nothing like what's going on now. Jackson, Mississippi, you're aware of those things that happened. And we're talking about American things, but of course, all over the world, things are happening. And the floods in Pakistan, where I also have friends and colleagues, was unbelievable. It caused more than 1,500 deaths. And those are just a couple of examples of things that are made worse by this very, very difficult set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, we can no longer ignore these realities. Perhaps that's why you're here. That's why Patrick and his colleagues here at the APS were wise enough to develop that fabulous exhibition and this tonight. The climate crisis is real. It's beginning to be taken more seriously in the halls of Congress. We saw recently with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and some elements of the bipartisan infrastructure law. These bills, while certainly far from panaceas, to put it mildly, indicate some bipartisan recognition that now we've got to start acting on some of these things as a country. Against that backdrop, the fact that APS has chosen to convene such a broad range of policymakers, scholars across wide disciplines to talk about the effects of the climate crisis on all aspects of life is not a surprise. And it's not a surprise because of the APS's track record of curiosity and collaboration. To expand a little tiny bit on Patrick's introduction, Benjamin Franklin founded the organization to promote what he called useful knowledge, and particularly relevant in the current age in which misinformation is also rampant in our society. While the climate crisis has come into view most recently with these disasters that I mentioned very briefly, as well as new research predicting significantly rising sea levels, caring about the planet is by no means a new endeavor for the APS. If you go back into the 19th century, you will find many APS members who then were already beginning to create the institutions that today provide the backbone for the discipline of climate science, in my view. Moving ahead to the 20th century, you can see that some APS members created some of the first computers and models that laid the foundation for what scientists use and know today. And many of the scientists who depend on this technology are now actually elected members of the APS themselves. And the APS, as was mentioned, actively supported expeditions throughout the globe, partly to capture data and observations that would be useful in understanding the global climate. And I want to share one last little known fact before we get to the heart of the discussion tonight. You may not be aware, but the APS actually played a central role in creating the entire state of Pennsylvania's Department of Conservation, something I didn't know until recently, and of course Patrick taught me that. In future talks, though, I'm going to claim that I taught you that, but for tonight we'll be honest. In fact, the first state forest is named the Michaud Forest in honor of the APS use of its Michaud endowment to support the conservation of forests. So we're in the company tonight of an impressive group of people who are creative and forward thinkers and are committed to tackling what we admittedly have to say are some of the toughest challenges of our time. Somehow being here among all of you bright people and being in the APS building again makes me feel more optimistic. So with that brief introduction, let's dive in. So Renee, I'm going to start with you. As a physician, let me start with a question for you. I have great respect for your work of all kinds, and especially for the relevance of this question, your work in the emergency department at Harvard. You and your colleagues in emergency medicine around the country are literally saving lives, dealing with real and very tangible emergencies, everything from trauma to heart attacks and so much more. But tell me and us, and all the folks listening on the live stream, why you're here today. Why should the climate crisis of all topics occupy space in the mind of an emergency physician as a health issue when there are so many other pressing health issues to consider? And how might we think about the climate crisis affecting our personal health, including, for example, someone who lives right here in Philadelphia? Renee, share your thoughts, please.
Well, thank you, David. And thank you to APS for hosting this. It's an honor and privilege to be here with this esteemed panel. So as an emergency medicine physician, I'm trained to respond to emergencies. But increasingly, I feel like I'm in the emergency department pulling patients out of the river as they're drowning one at a time, only to see many more behind. And so increasingly, I have to walk upstream to figure out what's causing my patients to fall into the river in the first place. And that has led me to some unexpected places. And so perhaps a patient case might exhibit it best. So there was a 4-year-old who came in on a busy overnight shift in Boston. And she came in, it was her 3rd visit that week for an asthma attack. And as she was struggling to breathe and we were giving her medications to open her airways and stabilize her, I'll never forget her mother looking at me and just saying, "We are doing everything that the doctors have told us to do, and she just keeps getting worse. What am I missing?" So long after they went upstairs to their hospital bed, I was looking through her records, and I saw that her teams were following all of the evidence-based guidelines. But she just kept getting worse, which made me question, what are we missing? So I looked up her address. Now, in medicine, we measure vital signs. Vital signs are important. But I never thought about an address as a vital sign. But she actually lived really close to a highway. And the American Thoracic Society has found that when children are exposed long-term to air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels, especially from traffic, that it actually is causative, so can cause asthma in children. Now, causality is the holy grail in medicine, right? When we can figure out what the cause is, then we can actually target that root cause and truly prevent at its source. Otherwise, oftentimes I feel like I'm putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And so that wasn't the only thing, though, that was really causing issues in managing her disease. Pollen levels had been having record highs, and climate change is actually driving pollen levels higher. In addition, heat increases the amount of ground level ozone because it facilitates the chemical reaction. And we'd been experiencing record spring heat. So she was having this trifecta, this storm that was contributing to that. Now, I recognize as a busy clinician, sometimes it can be hard to think about tackling these new diagnoses, because I argue this is really a diagnosis. The burning of fossil fuels is driving air pollution and climate change. But it's also an enormous opportunity for us to get upstream and get to these root causes. So while this diagnosis means I need a new toolbox, it is fundamental that I go upstream, because I think an equitable transition away from fossil fuels is a prescription for improved health and equity in my patients. So that's why I care about it. And then to your second question, which is great, as far as what are the, I'll try to just paint a really broad picture and look forward to people, if there's areas we want to dive into, but I really start all the way upstream. So burning of fossil fuels creates air pollution. In addition to being causative for asthma in children, it also is causative for heart disease. The American Heart Association determined that over a decade ago. So when we talk about improving heart health, we talk about lowering blood pressure or optimizing your cholesterol. But we don't talk about the air we breathe. So there's an enormous opportunity for us to improve heart health through cleaner air. It also, air pollution does multiple other things. But then when we think about climate change, again, primarily driven from the burning of fossil fuels, causes a breadth of health harms, which are frightening from a clinician standpoint. More extreme heat, which has numerous implications. They found 1/3 of heat-related deaths are actually caused from climate change. In addition, it causes more air quality issues, wildfire smoke. When we think about food and water impacts, and vector-borne diseases, Lyme disease, something else we have to think about here in Pennsylvania, allows ticks and mosquitoes to live longer and in new places. It's causing extreme weather disruptions, as we know, which has broad implications for health. Mental health, healthcare delivery. If you want to be able to make sure you can go to your doctor or your hospital when you need it, then we need to make sure that the infrastructure is standing, that it has power, and it has the supplies we need to provide the high-quality care that you deserve and expect. And then, of course, it causes displacement, and I can't think of someone who's more at risk for health harms than someone who's away from their home healthcare system. So that is just a broad painting, but there's enormous opportunity here, and we have the solutions we need, which is why I'm excited for this conversation.
That's just terrific. And later, if we have time and people are interested, you've heard the phrase, perhaps, social determinants of health, and some of the newer epidemiological literature is using a broader term called vital conditions for health. And in addition to healthcare, vital conditions for health is to have an environment that's optimized for health. So that's terrific. Thank you so much, Renée, and for all you do. Matty, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. Your background in creating this experimental collaboratory, I love that word, at Drexel, is a really excellent example of that kind of granular approach. What are some of the ways you think society can do a better job of making the climate crisis more tangible and relevant at the community level, and not just talking about the problems, but importantly, starting to work for solutions? And why is now the moment for jumping in and taking action? Matty, over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. Just a little bit about the Environmental Collaboratory and why I came to the great city of Philadelphia. You know, I've done work at a national stage, international stage, and frankly, I'm tired of conversations. The solution to climate must be at a community level. The fact is, we've ignored the canary in the coal mine for too many years. Communities have been facing disproportionate disease, cancer, in lower income communities of color in this country and other countries. We've ignored that, right? We've allowed this intersection of policy and economic systems to be someone else's problem, right? And so now we've seen the global manifestation of an imperfect economic system that places externalities, to borrow the economist who may be in the room. So we have to figure out a way of internalizing that burden that we place initially on the poorest in society, now all of society. And I believe, having participated in climate conferences internationally, is that the only way to solve these problems is to do it at a community level. You know, understand the dynamics of the community, the population, the demographics of the community, the current disparities of the community, and their social services. You know, so I mean that is a backdrop. To borrow on your heat statistic, I just want to throw the statistic out. 30% of the globe's population will be facing a heat emergency if the temperature rises to 2 degrees. And we are now at 1.3, right? To get between 1.3 and 1.5, most people believe that means an additional 80% of energy in the globe's environment. I mean, if you get your head around 80% more, we're already seeing the manifestation in the current travesty in Florida. The reason why the hurricane became so severe in such a short period of time is because the oceans were the highest temperature it has been in quite a long time. It absorbed all that heat. So, you know, we have this heat. So what do we do about it, right? So we need to first get people out of harm's way. One of the things that I find missing in the climate conversation is getting people out of harm's way. There are people in this city who've died, people in New York that died from the flooding that happened last year. People have died from heat. Our emergency response system is not built around the current emergency. So we need to begin with kind of an emergency response framework first. And I think there's a tendency to frankly skip over that. Tendency, I mean, we had a great bipartisan infrastructure law. I'll get to that later. We had a great infrastructure, the IRA, which, by the way, I hate the acronym. You smart, you know. But you know, we had to first get people out of harm's way, and also we need to look at cascading impacts. You know, one of the Drexel researchers is looking at this: how many people avoid preventative medicine because of health and flood events. And we know anecdotally that's happening. And so what are the cascading effects of avoiding medical intervention? So those are some of kind of the near-term things that people are not paying attention to. It's not in either one of the bills, right? I'm just telling you a little bit of where I'm going to go with this, you know. And I guess we'll get to the bill and IRA a bit later. All I will say is, if it's delivered in the history of how infrastructure is delivered, we will fail, right? And even if it is going to deliver it, we still fall short by 10%. So most analysts, most modelers believe that 10% It's about delivering solutions at a local level, getting local stakeholders around the table to problem solve together, which deals with the politics, deals with local budgeting and local government requirements to kind of begin solving that problem. So I will pause, and I'll look forward to your next question.
I do want to, before I go on to our next question, I do want to thank and recognize both of you for having this orientation toward the community. And, in the world of academic medicine, we talk about the so-called tripartite missions of research, medical education, and healthcare delivery. But we're arguing at the AAMC that community needs to be added as a fourth leg of the stool, just as important. And one other editorial comment, for whatever it's worth, is I believe often people who are suffering ill effects of whatever the situation may be need to be asked their wisdom in helping to solve it. Because the people who are suffering it have a certain perspective that even those of us who are well-intentioned may not have and probably won't have. So I congratulate both of you on having that community orientation. But now the congratulations is over. Now I get back to grilling you, which is more fun. So now we're speaking about solutions. Here's some stuff for both of you, and you can fight over who wants to answer first. But just fight verbally. We don't want any problems on stage here. Some of the things are short-term, immediate things that need to be done, and some are longer-term solutions. Is there a balance we need to strike? I realize that's a very big question in terms of short versus long-term. Or to put it a different way, how much should we be focusing on ways to collectively do a better job of protecting our planet in the longer-term future versus efforts that are focused on mitigation of what's happening sort of immediately in real ways every day? Whichever one of you would like to take that first, please.
Glad to go. So I will start going back to emergency response, and I believe the polarization of the climate debate is because we've not paid attention to the short-term effects and short-term solutions. I always talk about farmers. I'm farming in my family. I'm an amateur farmer. Some of my crops do well, some not so well. But the farming community has seen a reduction in production going back 20 years. And we fail to recognize that. So I think we need to do both short and long term, but society and economies tend to look long term at the cost of short term, right? So we need to do short term, we need to protect people from harm's way. So in my mind, there is the emergency preparedness and response. There's the adaptation, which is a broad category. How do we adapt agricultural production, infrastructure, and then looking at mitigation. How do we meet the goals of greenhouse gas reduction? I think we need to do, I almost hate the short-term versus long-term. I think we need to do all of them in an intentional and aligned way.
Thank you. Renee, please argue with him. Let's make it interesting.
Yeah. No, I agree, and maybe I think about this implicitly, but from an emergency medicine standpoint, if a patient is crashing, we have a critical window to act. And if we give a medication too late, it won't have the life-saving benefit that it would have if we gave it earlier. And we're in that critical window. So from my standpoint, we need to do everything at the same time in this moment because we are in that critical moment. So I agree with you in the sense that, we need to think about adaptation and mitigation together. They are synergistic. If we're going to implement adaptation in ways to be able to help protect people, especially people's health, let's make sure that we're doing it in a way that is also sustainable and is mitigating. And we actually know, for example, if we are doing solar panels or other aspects for healthcare facilities, it actually creates resiliency during storms, so they won't have power outages as a result of intensification of extreme weather, so can actually operate better to be able to deliver better care to their patients. And I think the other piece is that we have to help people recognize the near-term benefits of mitigation. Mitigation, let's be honest, I know we're talking about that later, but it's wonky, right? And people don't necessarily understand what a solar panel means. But to me, A solar panel is actually a prescription for improved health. That patient I talked to you about, her not being exposed to traffic pollution. So if we have electric vehicles and solar panels, and that improved air quality that's happening in the short term, that is something that we can grab onto, and hopefully people can mobilize around the improved health, especially for people who are disproportionately exposed now, in addition to making sure we're minimizing the suffering long term. So I think health, at least from my standpoint, is an opportunity for us to really hit home the benefits of action now, in addition to preparing for a better and just future.
Super.
So if I can just add, I completely disagree with you, no, just kidding. He wanted me to do that.
I was hoping.
No.
So, you mentioned the role of community, and I think too often, all of us tend to look at communities as the recipient and not part of the solution. So this weekend, we held the first ever UN-sanctioned climate youth conference at Drexel. And one of the things that emerged was the importance of indigenous knowledge and how historically academic analysis has ignored indigenous knowledge, So both in terms of specific knowledge that have emerged over generations, but also understanding the community. Solving short, medium, and long term is different community by community. Different by the economics of a community, the demographics of a community. The community must be part of the solution building. So,
It's very interesting in that regard. At the AAMC, we have a thing called the Center for Health Justice, and they've developed a national polling mechanism to ask community members across the country and people who work with them certain specific questions. And they developed a series of 10 what they called principles of trustworthiness, where the community members helped us to understand what they believe would have to be done to make the healthcare system more trustworthy. And one of the 10 principles of trustworthiness was, you're not the only experts. Not to say you're not the experts, but you're not the only experts. And what a great example you just showed. Okay, let's try for some more friction here on the next question.
we get on this.
Yeah.
Now, both of you have talked about disproportionate, or if you want to put it a different way, using an equity lens, if you will, to look at these kinds of issues. And unfortunately, like everything else, there are communities, families, areas of the country, in every city and every rural area that are affected differently in negative ways. Keeping with this idea of short-term and long-term and the wisdom you both have shared, how can we add that equity lens, implementing solutions that will have an equitable impact in the future, given that things vary so much in this fair city and all over the country? Would you want to start on that one, Renee?
Yeah. Well, I brought up my patient's address as a vital sign. And the fact that she was close to a highway was not an accident. So there are decisions and policies that decide where health-harming infrastructure goes and where health-promoting infrastructure like parks or green space go. And so then the second piece is that when we think about redlining, which we know is an outlawed historical practice that targeted Blacks, that those areas that were historically redlined are still hotter today. And so there's these downstream implications, right, of these policy decisions, which I would say shows that we can take policy and make sure that it's health promoting and not health harming. But those areas that are previously redlined are somewhat tied 7 degrees higher from a surface, from an air temperature, and have been recorded like upwards of 20 degrees if you're looking at surface temperature. But all of that means that it's going to be harder for them to deal with extreme heat. So there could be neighboring neighborhoods that are cooler, and that obviously has enormous health implications. So I think we have to recognize that environmental racism and systemic racism and economic injustice has very clear health implications for my patients. And that is an enormous opportunity for us from a triage standpoint. Again, this theme of emergency response, that in the emergency department, we triage you based off your acuity. So if you are the sickest, then we see you first and we put all of our attention on you first. And we have to do the same thing for the communities that have disproportionately been bearing the health harms of climate change and fossil fuel pollution.
Matty, your thoughts?
So, I mean, something that you said about causation, I think we need to be more deliberative, translating association to causation. And we talk about the highways, right? And so we need to first begin with disentangling infrastructure that were placed in a very divisive way. You know, I grew up in New York City. I don't have too much of a New York accent, but if you're all familiar with Robert Moses, Robert Moses separated the city using the purse strings along racial and economic lines, you know, and that got repeated across the country. So they've divided the country using infrastructure. So we need to first be honest that infrastructure has divided, that division has led to poorer health outcomes, poorer environmental. So we need to begin with that and begin to have everyone voice that recognition in a public way. I found that people, I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, but these are the facts, right? So we need to really be honest that this country's infrastructure has divided along health and economic lines. And the second is, I think the Justice 40, if you all are familiar with, that actually emerged out of a New York City community's demand that migrated its way into the Biden administration. So, I mean, it's elegant and challenging at the same time. It's elegant in that for the first time in federal policy, the federal government has said 40% of this huge investment should benefit the most disadvantaged communities. It's the first time ever, right? So we need to be able to pull the organizing, the political pressure to deliver that, which is not going to be easy. And then also, speaking about politics, we need to have established a widely recognized data foundation of inequity. You know, the only way to minimize politics is to having a data grounding of how communities should be targeted for benefits. Because otherwise, you're going to get into this city and every other city, every council member, every Congress member is going to say, no, what about my community? So we need to have a collective agreement that the data speaks for itself, and the data says that certain communities are currently more harmed and should be more benefited.
Yeah, I wish people would listen to that wisdom. It's very strong wisdom. I'm getting signals, subtle signals, that we need to open it up to the audience pretty soon. One of the signals was this, but we're gonna just steal a couple more quick questions here. You know, coming from Washington, D.C., everything is always politics. You ask someone what time it is. What do you mean by that? You know, this kind of thing. Let's hit the BIL and the IRA just for a moment. And Matty, would you kick that off?
Sure.
I'm looking for risks and opportunities in both the BIL and the IRA. And like you, I hate these acronyms, but give us to sort of a short view of that, risks and opportunities.
So, you know, it is a historic opportunity to change the trajectory of this country and the globe. But it's not going to happen without technical assistance to the most vulnerable communities. So we're trying to build out at Drexel, working with universities around the country to deliver technical assistance to governments and communities that historically do not receive those funds. You know, it's built on a program that I built out during the Obama administration. The fact is, as an ex-New Yorker, I can say this, New York, Chicago, and LA get a disproportionate amount of share of the awards because they have the capacity to compete for these federal resources, technical assistance to deliver a bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Similarly, I think IRA is a good investment. Bill and IRA, I hate to use acronyms, still was going to leave a 10% gap, right? And the 10% gap can largely be filled not with new technology, but delivering technology in an intelligent, aligned way. Linking clean energy with battery storage, with clean fuel fleets can substantially change the trajectory of mitigation in this country. But we need to create the political climate at the local level to be able to execute that 80%, that 10% gap in achieving our goals.
Thoughts, Renee?
I think there's an enormous opportunity for us to make sure that the health and equity benefits are maximized as this is rolled out. But to your point, if we don't have a data-driven approach to that, then we can potentially further harm health. So as an example, there's some research that shows depending on where electric vehicle charging stations are placed,
exactly.
if they're pulling from fossil fuel generated energy, that it's actually going to worsen air pollution in the very communities that have already been disproportionately bearing that brunt. So we need to have a data-driven, evidence-based way. And obviously, from my vantage point, putting health and equity as, again, not only the reason that we're doing this in order to maximize those benefits, but should be our driving, again, maximizing of those outcomes, which can be enormous.
If my colleagues would permit, let's take some questions from here at the APS hall and perhaps some from the live stream. So remember, the deal we made was the pop flies go to me, the line drives go to my colleagues. So
You'll have to pat this one which way it's supposed to go. But Becoming Weatherwise, our exhibition, it's not just about how scientists became weatherwise. It actually has a didactic purpose too. And what's the visitor to become more weatherwise, not to be otherwise, as Franklin's statement said. So I was wondering if you both could talk about awareness, public awareness. You've talked a lot about policy and things that should be changed, often at a government level, whether it's infrastructure or changes in regulations. But this is affecting people's health, as we heard. So what is the public awareness in your estimate right now, and how could that change? What is not happening that should happen?
You want to go?
There's an enormous opportunity for people to understand the connections and the benefits of climate action for improving their health. And so I think for many ways, I think climate change has been about polar bears and icebergs. And trust me, I love polar bears and icebergs, but it's not really personal. And our discussion has also been very future oriented. And our human psychology doesn't necessarily process the future very well. And here we are at a moment where we are seeing climate change play out in our headlines and in our lives in ways that are accelerated. And so we're starting to get that near-term realization, but there's even more benefit for us to really put it, from my standpoint, in a health context, because then it becomes about improving the health of your children and your neighbors and your parents and yourself. And you can begin to see those near-term benefits of why we need to act now.
Matty, thoughts?
So I'm going to borrow a Gen Z phrase about okay doomer, right? I think people are flooded with the problem, but not enough information about solving problems. You know, so one of the projects that we're planning to take up is how do you translate the impenetrable data of flooding in a way that communities can understand and have access to and can lead solutions, you know? So one of the things, there is no reason in the biggest era of data why it is not accessible for communities to drive solutions. I'll stop there.
Do you think, and trying to answer a really important question, Patrick, thank you for that. Do you think we're depending too much on media and on something that's meant to go to the a large market, so to speak, as opposed to having communication approaches that are customized to a community?
I mean, that is a great question. I think you can do a bit of both, but I do think that you just need to be honest. I mean, if you go to Berks County in Pennsylvania, you may not want to use climate change as your phraseology, right? Mm-hmm. You may want to talk about increased production of agricultural yields. You know, I mean, there was a project in Kansas where they failed in talk about the link between renewable energy and climate change. Then they switched to cost savings. You know, and so I think tailoring the message based on the community as it is, not what they wished it to be, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Do you agree with that, Renee?
I do. I think we have to meet people where they are, and I think health professionals, we've been doing that forever. We meet and counsel people about people's blood pressure, or they should have better diet. We always have to meet people where they are. And the data has shown that even those who are have less belief, or I'll use belief, I suppose, in the data of climate change, if you look at who they'll listen to, and they had a whole spectrum of people, so WHO or friends and family, climate scientists, that actually their primary care physician was their most trusted individual for that data. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to really customize at an individual level what climate change means to someone when we can put it in the context of their respective risk factors and their respective health and environment.
Yeah,
Can I just add something? I mean, I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, and I'm on messaging. I'm a big believer in mavens and connectors, right? I mean, I think you tip messages by connecting with local mavens and local connectors. You know, we used to have this big fight in the Obama administration, is that we too much tailored to the New York Times and the LA Times, where, I'm sorry, only 20% of the people really get information from the New York Times. It's like, how do you get it local to the people to the institutions and people that are trusted locally to deliver that message?
and I think the first way is to ask them how they want to get their information. Yeah, so that's good. Great question. Are there other questions from folks here? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Yep, thank you. And thanks so much for the presentations. Given the burden of care that I think healthcare needs to provide, given the emergency, my question is a little unfair, but I'm really wondering about political action. And I'm thinking of a historical example, the International Physicians Against Nuclear Weapons, for instance, it won the Nobel Prize that really identified the danger to humanity. Given a kind of global threat, this group may, alas, be relevant again. I'm thinking also of a contemporary example, Scientists' Rebellion, in terms of a group of experts that is now using a political group in action to elevate public consciousness. So I'm really wondering at this moment, what might be going on, what could be going on in terms of political action coming from healthcare professionals. And again, thank you for your presentation.
So let me say something because Renee will be too modest to say it. So the National Academy of Medicine, which congratulations again for being elected, has developed a so-called Action Collaborative for decarbonizing the U.S. health sector. And Renee is one of the leaders of that. If you look at the way that is put together, there are caregivers, there are experts, there are supply chain people, there are nitty-gritty people about Scope 3, and there's people who are politically savvy. It's co-chaired by the Assistant Secretary of Health, Admiral Rachel Levine, and some private sector folks. So it's an updated version of that in which it was recognized that, and I'm going to ask Renee to comment on this, to decarbonize, and I'm going to ask you to define that, you need to have a combination of expertise, a really complicated combination of expertise. But I think that's not the only example. There's many other organizations that are working on this, but that is the nation's sort of highest level of standard for the medical community getting involved directly with others that they normally wouldn't interact with that much. And you're one of the leaders on that. Share a couple thoughts about that Action Collaborative and define decarbonization.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think short answer is yes, it's coming. I think climate change threatens a very fundamental mission of medicine, which is to improve health, prevent harm, and accelerate equity. And I think that there's an enormous opportunity for the health sector to fundamentally tie that together and show the decarbonization, which just means essentially make sure that the processes that you're doing within healthcare delivery is not contributing to the problem. So transitioning away from the burning of fossil fuels to renewable energy sources like solar and wind. But I think the unique opportunity of healthcare is that we are embedded in every other sector. We get our energy from, the energy grid for the most part. We have a supply chain that is interconnected across multiple sectors. So we can, from a mission-driven standpoint, really model, and I think have a responsibility to model, that we're improving the health of our patients and communities through doing this, and then we can start to knock down those dominoes and help accelerate what's already happening to say, look, we're only gonna purchase our supplies from you if you are also committed to decarbonization. or put pressure on, again, the power of community action and community engagement of making sure that we're transitioning those local power grids to renewable energy.
And one of the things that's I'm sorry, I'll be very short. One of the things very encouraging about this effort that Renée is helping to lead is that it's predicated on the idea that healthcare is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I forgot the numbers, you'll help me. 8% roughly?
8.5, yeah.
8.5% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the healthcare sector. Think about those big, huge buildings open 24/7. Think about the research labs going all the time. And so it's a chance for us to let down and say we're part of the problem and also come together. And Matty, I'm sorry, you were going to add something.
I want to kind of respond to the broader issue of political action. And I believe that the most important opportunity is action with local governments. And we're actually starting a Pennsylvania-wide, a bipartisan climate initiative built on the Pennsylvania constitutional provision for environmental protection. And it is not really a well-known provision of the Pennsylvania Constitution. But we're trying to fill the capacity gap. Local government officials have a lean budget. And how do you provide resources for them in terms of best practices so they can adopt it and integrate it? So I believe the most important political action is how can we drive action at the local level, working with local government officials?
Terrific. There was a question here as well. Yes, please.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm here, so I'll put on my mask to make it a little less awkward.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about if you could just reflect on if there are limits to the kind of renewable energy decarbonized paradigm. And I'm asking that question as someone who's committed to my home community, a rural Black community that's often posited even within Green Horizons as a place for biofuel production, but not necessarily that framework not necessarily transforming the relationship to those communities. So, and I think we could extend that nickel, all of the, like, are there limits and dangers to decarbonize when we know that nickel is also being mined at gunpoint and very much a part of colonial extractivism?
Yeah, so
A great question.
I was leading something called the Global Battery Alliance. I was looking at the battery value chain, looking at the child labor abuses in the cobalt value chain. So I think, the effort should be about dealing with directly, being honestly, how do we eradicate corruption and child labor from the value chain? So, I mean, we need to do, like in every other sector, eradicate the bad practices in those value chain, So I think we need to go really big, go really hard on all forms of renewable energy, but we need to make sure it is truly renewable. Like hydrogen is different than green hydrogen, right? So we need to make sure we do all of that. I will just say one other commentary about renewable energy. I think there's been a misplacement between the subsidy of renewable energy and the subsidy on energy storage. We're only going to drive down fossil fuels through energy storage. Because for every megawatt of solar energy produced, unless you have 1 megawatt of storage, you're not going to be able to utilize that. And the ratio is even worse for wind energy. So one, we need to, be really precise about renewable energy, making sure it's truly renewable, and really make sure that we're linking up all the in a sense, the chains to make it work in an optimized way.
It's really a terrific question. And if we do face a recession, and it's beyond the United States, it's going to make a lot of these things harder to do, for sure. Great question. Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more, if we could sneak them in. Is that all right, Patrick? Okay. I thought I saw another hand. Here's one. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, please. Yeah, just ignore me. You go ahead first.
Yeah. Bob Hauser, American Philosophical Society. And I've heard a lot of things this evening that I think are very encouraging, but the one where I really have some skepticism has to do with the importance of data and getting people to do the right thing. I've been a social statistician all my life, and I always believed that data would tell us what to do, but I'm really pessimistic about that in light of what I've observed. And there are two sides to that. One is I've been a part of at least two major efforts to create much more comprehensive and useful data systems. One, some of you may be old enough to remember the social indicators movement. And there was a later thing on a smaller scale where we failed to get any traction to produce the kind of data that we really need. And the other side of it is people ignoring data. I got my start looking at a few years ago, looking at urban renewal in Chicago and what it was doing to poor and minority families, and nobody gave a damn. And so and I think that's true. I'm sure you can think of examples yourself where people just ignore the data. Alan Blinder's recent book as an economist, and supposedly economists are the people who really get listened to. And the major theme of his book is nobody pays attention. And there's a lovely book by Ken Pruitt, who once ran the census, which is published by the National Research Council, which is about how we don't have a science about how you connect what we know from data with the kinds of decisions that people will make in public affairs.
Can I take a stab at this?
Sure.
First of all, nobody said we were going to have a world-famous social scientist interrupt this nice proceedings tonight, because they tend to ask very tough questions. But, one of the, Bob, I don't know your feelings about this, but one of the things that those of us in that certain generation have felt is that if the data were clear, people would come and drink from the well, and so on. And that's a sort of a point of view that doesn't really work that well. Even in times where, maybe things were not quite as fragmented as they are now in social media, there's always been disbelief and mistrust. And in the health field, mistrust is rampant. It's just rampant, even among non-minority communities. If you look at the vaccination rates and so on, worse in certain areas, but a lot of mistrust. So I go back to the comments that both our colleagues made about community, and that was brought up, Matty, that going locally is more important than having a national study that we think people are going to come and drink from the well. You have to have the data, you have to have the people having the deliberations, but the nexus, the connection between that broad thinking and people's everyday life, at least my generation, I don't think we paid attention to that nexus. We thought people would listen to us because we had letters after our name or we published in big journals, but that's not where they get their information. So I think that's part of the problem. Please, Matty, I interrupted you.
So the whole data can go many, many different ways, and I would agree that data and behavioral changes is a complex science, and I think there's a little bit of panacea on that. But I would say that European Union has adopted something called product passports as a way of particularly driving the link between finance and the supply chain. So we are in the biggest era of data, but we're not utilizing data to drive change. And I just want to underscore what I mean by the biggest era of data. It's direct data, not secondary data. I don't want to overblow kind of blockchain, but we have an opportunity to have direct data decisions for the first time in history. Are we willing to use that to drive decision? And we got to be intentional about it, because I think you're right. Data is not going to drive change without having intentionality behind it. So I'll just stop there.
And then one other thing to Bob's question, as important as the governmental actions are, and they're critical, a lot of things can be done by the private sector without the government. And again, the work that you've done has shown that, and the work that you're doing, Renee, by leading the National Academy of Medicine bit, there's a lot of interactions with the private sector, not waiting for government to make a change.
So can I just say, I mean, the biggest driver of this product passport was actually some of the largest EV companies and battery companies.
It's a great example.
Who wanted to figure out a way of using data to drive out corrupt sources in the system. I mean, the issues of child labor are really, really complex. But they, I mean, the biggest, I mean, this is Tesla, this is some of the largest companies in the world. They came to the table along with some of the biggest finances like BlackRock, is like, listen, we do not want to see your reports anymore. We want a data-driven basis of tell me how you can track your source of a rock from Democratic Republic of Congo, to right now it's going to China and then coming back to us. So.
My watch says we have to stop. This has
Well,
been
I think we do have a question online, and I do want to make
Great.
sure that we get some
Super.
of our online listeners. So,
Super. That would be
Nathan, I'll turn it
wonderful.
to you.
All right. I have a question from one of our online viewers. It says, has the impact and response to the COVID-19 pandemic across the globe changed how you view climate change action today?
Wow. Soft, easy
Well,
question.
and actually I can parallel that one off of this. There's a lot of places we could go with this, but I'll keep my comment short. But I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that one message does not resonate across the U.S.
bet.
evenly, just to really
bet.
parallel and tie that question with the last one. And in my regard, from a health standpoint and from a behavior change standpoint, and to ensure that we can optimally protect health of my patients and communities, is we can learn from those lessons and recognize that the current environment mandates again, with health and equity at the core, that if I want to optimally improve health and equity, I have to take into account disinformation, misinformation, polarization, all of those pieces. And I think it's a responsibility for us, for climate change, to make sure that we take the lessons from the pandemic and make sure we don't repeat them with climate change.
Yeah. And I would just say, interestingly, the COVID supply chain issues is fundamentally going to change the global economy. The first time, probably in 50 years, we're seeing reshoring of entire supply chains, which, by the way, will also decarbonize the supply chain. So I think it's an interesting phenomenon that's going across the globe, and it's actually embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act.
one lesson that I learned from COVID, which is sort of a down way to end the panel, but in 2022, the country is still not married to the idea of preparedness. We tend to be reactive and don't want to get prepared because you're facing today's crisis. Who can think about something that might happen or might not happen 5 or 10 years hence? And I believe, among all the other wisdom that our panelists have shared, unless we have a real change of our thinking, that preparedness is somehow felt to be a very important item today for something that may happen in the future, we're going to still continue to stub our toes. Anyway, I want to thank our panelists. They were great. Thank Patrick for putting it together.